Hello everyone, it's Dr. K, writing under oath. I want to talk about philosophies of truth and how these philosophies relate to writing under oath, nonfiction, and accuracies of fact. Now these ideas begin with the ancient Greeks, so let's take a look at these. The ancient Greeks believed that truth was associated with memory. So this was before the invention of language. So whatever was collectively remembered among groups of people and passed through generations constituted what was true. So the better your memory, the more perfectly you would remember a story and be able to pass it down. So it's no wonder that without a written language, truth would be associated with the stories that were conveyed from generation to generation. Then we move on to Plato, whose definition of truth was embedded in his idea of perfect forms. So Plato had an idea, for example, of a chair, right? A chair. But the chair we see is only an imperfect representation of the perfect form of a chair. Now, humans cannot see or ascertain this perfect form. We can only vaguely know about it. And he used the idea, the illustration of the people by the cave, the allegory of the cave. So Plato told a story where a bunch of guys were chained to the ground facing a cave, and there was a fire lit that cast shadows on the cave wall. Their backs were turned to people who were marching by with objects like a vase or a flower or a lamp or a puppet, and they would march by with these things on sticks, and the people chained to the ground looking at the cave wall were seeing the shadows that these objects cast. When the people were unchained and showed the objects that cast the shadows, they argued and said, no, these objects aren't reality. It's the shadows on the wall that we saw. That's reality. Well, Plato links the idea of a chair as being like a shadow cast by the perfect form of a chair, unknowable, and hence rather impractical for our purposes. So, we move on to the medieval notion of truth, which was that truth was passed down through the king, the church, and God, and only knowable in this hierarchy. So the average guy, you and me, we did not have access to truth unless it was told to us by a king, a church, a priest, or God. So any ideas that we came up with regarding truth were false unless corrected by one of the people in these hierarchies. We move on then to Milton, who associated truth with a marketplace of ideas. So what does that mean? Well, a marketplace of ideas is generated when people have scholarly philosophical discussions about issues, and whatever is created through these discussions represents the truth. He foreshadowed the period of the Enlightenment idea of truth, in which the correspondence theory was developed. The correspondence theory asserts that truth should correspond to some external set of facts. Okay? Now this most closely resembled what we now identify as science, the science of truth. That truth is only knowable if there is some reference in nature that we can point to. So when I point to this chair and I say that the chair is a fact of nature, it exists, what I'm saying is that there is a chair, a rock-solid chair that corresponds to the message of a chair, the description of a chair. This is opposite to what Plato talked about, where the chair didn't actually exist. It was a vague, imperfect form of an ideal form. Well, in the Enlightenment idea of truth and in science, the chair is the only perceptible, actual, factual means of knowing reality. It is actually more real than the descriptions used to talk about the chair. It's more reliable than the idea of a chair. Now, this idea of truth linked to science foreshadowed what would become modern journalism, because modern journalism assumes that there is a direct correspondence between a description of an event and the actual event, and that if the event does not literally correspond to its description in news and journalism, then what we're being told by the message is a lie. This is very, very important in notions of truth, this correspondence theory. Now, after we leave the Enlightenment period, we get to a modern, basically postmodern theory of truth known as pragmatism. The pragmatists believed that truth was based upon perception, human perception, so that truth was relative. That meant that actually any kind of idea about truth was acceptable. They even believed that matter was relative. It depended upon who was doing the perceiving, and reality was defined as that which was probable, not as something intrinsic. Okay? Reality is only probable, not intrinsic in the thing itself. For Plato, truth was intrinsic in a perfect form, which we couldn't actually ever see. But for the pragmatist, there is no such thing as intrinsic truth. The object of the chair has no intrinsic truth to it, because I might perceive it as a chair and somebody else might perceive it as a handbag, not a chair. It's a particularly dangerous notion of truth, because truth changes depending upon who is doing the perceiving. So let's hang on to this idea of the correspondence theory of truth. It is vitally important when we talk about nonfiction that the object of the description must correspond exactly to the description, or it's a lie. This has a lot to do with the previous video on line structure. If I talk about a line and I say it has certain parts, then it better look like that in nature, because if it doesn't, it's not a line, it's something else. More to come. Thanks for listening. Dr. K, writing under oath.